on
Sorry
college
about that. Yeah.
in the West. And the kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing, I don't think we help ourselves conceptually by seeing it as a kind of prejudice, seeing it as a little bit of an unfortunate bigotry. Um, because when we do, we think of it as something that can be corrected
You can
by
stop
how
and
we
shut it
engage.
in.
One of the
It's your phone. If you want it to be connected.
is there a possibility for muting as the host? Can you just mute? Um,
Yes, I'm working on it. I just don't
Not
want to
me.
mute you. Yes.
Don't
So
mute me. I mean,
1 second. Yes.
I don't know, but
Yeah.
um, so a problematic prejudice is something you can fix. You fix it by educating people. You fix it by appealing to people's better intentions, and particularly among the kind of people who would populate most universities, there's a real, genuine goodwill on this kind of thing. So if you tell people that a certain kind of nomenclature they've been using or something they've maybe heard their, you know, grandparents or weird uncles using is no longer considered polite and no longer the way that these people want to be called. I think there's a willingness to change that. If you tell people that something that they thought of as being normal is actually a kind of prejudice, and not so socially acceptable, there's ordinarily a willingness to go about that. I think a great part of our discussion seems to want to conceive of this kind of anti-Semitism as like that. And I think, by the way, that's how a lot of Israelis perceive it, that Jews in America and in Europe are a minority, and that there's this rather unpleasant prejudice against them as a minority that's embattled and misunderstood and possibly discriminated against. But that's not what we're actually seeing. The kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing isn't a sort of prejudice. It's a very, very ideological anti-Semitism. It's the notions here about Israel and Jews, and there are two really sort of big notions
Recording
only
progress.
complement each other, that not only complement each other but actually reinforce each other, um, are part of a comprehensive ideological worldview. And that's not the kind of thing that you can just fix by a little bit of goodwill or by a new pronoun or by a more polite way of talking, or by going about and picking an argument with your slightly less sophisticated parent or grandparent when you're home for Thanksgiving. Um, if it were just a question of a prejudice, then the legions of committed, well-intentioned anti-racists on our college campuses would fix it today, yesterday. That's the first thing they want to do. The difficulty in fixing this is because it's actually very central to a comprehensive ideological worldview. The two reinforcing views that I mentioned earlier are, one, the view about Israel as the locus of global evil, as the stand-in for everything that's wrong, with the world order and with the recent world history. And two, the perception of Jews at home in America and in Europe as being a powerful network of people using their undue power to both preserve the privilege they have and to silence criticism of this nefarious Israeli state. Now, each of those two beliefs on their own sounds outlandish, but once you buy into one, you kind of need the other to make sense. And once you go back to the other, and that starts making sense, you need a more extreme view of the first one. Doesn't matter which one you started with, but those two work with each other. Because if you're an American, a young, enterprising, serious, scholarly American college student or professor, and you buy into the idea that this one state, Israel, is uniquely evil, not pursuing bad policies, but in its essence something evil, so bad that its existence is an affront, that the food its people eat is somehow tainted. Um, and you suddenly see that your own government actually supports Israel, and the majority of public opinion in your country does as well. You have to imagine that there's some kind of very powerful network of people who are somehow suppressing this, who are somehow standing in the way of this knowledge that you've attained. Um, and if you have any resistance on this knowledge and on the notion that that there is this powerful network conspiring to silence criticism, you can only make sense of that by imagining an even more Israel. And even more Israel is something you have to do for yourself each time there's a new escalation in the violence against Israelis and Jews from their enemies, as happened on October 7th. But this is something we witnessed in previous violent escalations, that there's this expectation that when people see something as awful as the October 7th pogrom, or before that, the suicide bombings, or before that, the airplane hijackings, or before that, the massacre of the Olympic team, that they'll actually see Israel's enemies in a negative light. But what often happens in this ideologically mobilized quarter is that the way of making sense of that kind of extreme violence is to now reimagine the Israelis as even worse than what you thought before, because that's the only explanation you can come up with for why these people could be so angry to do the things that they do. I don't think that situating all of this just in trendy language from the last couple of years about woke politics or decolonization, whatever, really captures what's happening, because this ideological frame set, which in my opinion is a deeply theological frame set, which I can expand on later, and I'm sure Einat will get to this as well, is on a very, very firm foundation of ideas that have been around for centuries in one form or another. But the connection to Israel and the placing of Israel and Israeli evil at the center of a comprehensive global worldview for much of the intellectual left is a project that has been ongoing for at least the last 40 years, if not slightly more. We see its manifestations each time there's some kind of violent Middle Eastern eruption, but that in and of itself is not new. What is slightly new since 2021 in the United States, and since about the year 2000, 2001 in Western Europe, is the willingness of fringe elements to take that intellectual basis and translate it into violence and threats of violence against Jews at home. But that too was a long-term project that took years of intellectual work to come to fruition, as it so regrettably has done in the United States recently.
So I'll build on what Shany said to make the argument that we talk about it indeed way too little. Because once you understand that what is happening is indicative of something much greater about society, then you understand that this is where the focus should be. And that goes to what Shany said about this not being a prejudice. I always looked at anti-Semitism, and I think a lot of the scholars look at it as basically a political idea, or I call it basically a scapegoating mechanism that is indicative of crisis in societies that have been built on either Christianity or Islam. So that's my definition of the rise of anti-Semitism, that it's first a scapegoating mechanism, which means it's basically a social political mechanism for redirecting social anger at a scapegoat. So it's a scapegoating mechanism, and it's a scapegoating mechanism that only really ever works in societies where Jews have been already pre-established as a useful and successful scapegoat. Because if you're a society in crisis and you need scapegoats, you don't have the time to start saying, let's scapegoat all people who use the term A, or who have blue eyes, or who have red hair, which are always kind of the examples used for prejudice. But if you're in immediate need for a scapegoat, you're more likely to reach for something that's already on the shelf, and in which a lot of previous generations have already invested so much work that you are essentially a free rider. So I think we can understand the current scapegoaters as free riding on millennia and centuries and decades of investment by others in creating an entire system that explains why Jews are to blame. My favorite thinker on societies in crisis and the mechanism of scapegoating, his name is René Girard, and he basically says that societies in crisis essentially ask two questions: what to do and who to blame. Societies that ask what to do, I mean, all societies ask both. The question is what you emphasize. So societies that emphasize what to do ultimately emerge from the crisis. Societies that emphasize who to blame tend to stay in the crisis and ultimately tend to collapse onto themselves. So I think the best way to understand the rise of iterations of anti-Semitism, its most recent iteration of anti-Zionism, is as indicative of a society in crisis that is failing to ask the question what to do and is preferring to ask the question of who to blame. And I think once you understand that, it opens up the big reason of why we're not talking about it enough. Because if your notion of anti-Jewish sentiment is that it is a fixed feature of the Christian and Muslim world, you are making an ahistorical argument that fails to explain why it rises at particular times in particular societies. It exists there as something on the shelf, as I said, that has a lot of cultural capital, so to speak, invested in it. But the question is, when do societies grab for this thing on the shelf? When do they need the scapegoat? And they need the scapegoat when they're in crisis and when they fail to ask the far more constructive and positive question of what to do. And the answer to why are Jews being persecuted has never been because the Jews. That has always been the excuse, but it has never been the real explanation. The real explanation was always to be found in what is happening in the society that is currently scapegoating, persecuting the Jews, that requires that scapegoat to begin with. And once you redirect the question, not to what have the Jews done this time? What has Israel done this time? But rather the question is, what is the problem with the society that is experiencing this phenomena? Then you begin to get closer to the answers. So for me, the reason that we're not talking about it enough is twofold. First, call it the selfish Jewish reason. Every time that a society enters a crisis and begins to scapegoat Jews, it doesn't end well for Jews. Quite simply, the rise, I always say that, for the last few years, I've participated in high-profile debates on whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and I lost them all. And the reason is that once you make the blanket statement, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you only need to bring the Satmar Jew in order to bring down the entire edifice. So I turn to saying, okay, it's actually not a theoretical question. We're not engaged in some theoretical questioning in academia. It's a practical question. What happens to Jews when anti-Zionism rises? And here you actually have no exceptions. The historical record is quite clear. Societies that become obsessed with anti-Zionism, with the scapegoating mechanism of the Zionists, ultimately turn on the Jews. They become a hostile environment to Jewish life, even though they always, whether it's the Arabs or the Soviet Union or Jeremy Corbyn, they always claim that it's not about the Jews. But the mechanism is very simple. You say that it's not about the Jews, and then you blame the Jews for having Zionist sympathies, regardless of whether it's true, and then you're done. So first, for the selfish Jewish reason, there's no arc in which the rise of anti-Zionism in America's leading institutions, leading shapers of the mindset, what Yuval Noah Harari would say, the narrative weavers. So if the narrative weavers of America are currently telling a story where the Zionists are to blame, where as you know, a few years ago, Cori Bush, others, they said things about we don't have health care because of the money that goes to Israel. If you know anything about financial proportions, that's really not the problem. But I called it the we can't have nice things because of Israel argument. But it's a classic scapegoating mechanism. The failure of America and American politicians to actually have universal health care. Those politicians who are supposedly at the forefront of trying to promote that find it much easier to say that their failure is due to Israel rather than to their incompetence as politicians. So the rise of anti-Zionism in a society never ends well for Jews, and it typically also never ends well for the society itself. The Arab world, ever since becoming anti-Zionist, has been a miserable basket case. And it's not a coincidence that the countries that are more interested now in pursuing prosperity are also the ones in the Arab world that are less interested in the scapegoating mechanism of anti-Zionism. The Soviet Union collapsed. Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party had the worst showing ever for labor in, 85 years. American universities are experiencing a destruction of value unparalleled. So it always turns against Jews, and the institutions themselves, the countries, the societies also collapse onto themselves. So anyone who cares about Jewish life in America and anyone who cares about America should talk much, much, much more about the emergence of the story that the Jews, the Zionists, are to blame.
Thank you, Shany. So everyone is talking about what happened, last week or 2 weeks ago, about, what happened, with the three university presidents. And here in Israel, it got a lot of headlines. I wanted to ask both of you, was that kind of a surprise of the answer of the response that you got, or based on your personal experience, was that something that you find it easy to believe?
I would have been shocked if there had been any other response, is the honest truth. I've had a few, I've run into this personally in a few incidents in my times at various academic institutions. But there was one that reminded me very much of the discussion there where where the university's administration was extremely lenient to some very unscholarly conduct, and that was clearly targeting me and others for being Jewish and for being Israeli. And I said to them, "Can you?" They gave me these very principled reasons why they wouldn't do anything. And I said to me, "Can you honestly tell me that if it weren't directed at Jews as Jews and Israelis as Israelis, but rather at any other kind of minority group, blacks, gays, women's, whatever, you would behave in the exact same way?" And it was really interesting because they all said to me, "I swear to you, I've behaved the exact same way." I mean, there were three senior figures at this point at that university, and they swore, and it was very embarrassing because it was so obviously a lie. I think they knew it was a lie when they were saying it, but that I have no way of saying.
Hey,
I don't know if they were self-consciously lying.
you should probably head out in like 15
Excuse me,
minutes.
I need sorry.
Got to mute.
Yes.
And that very much reminded me of in the question there. There was in a certain sense, I mean, the whole congressional hearing was not a particularly deep discussion of the matter, and some of the questions raised there were quite superficial, but that's what politics is, by the way, and you need to be prepared for that. And I don't even think that the principled argument that the university presidents gave was all that good. But let's set that aside. Let's say that they had given a wonderful principled argument and done it in a way that was more learned than what they actually did, more persuasive than what they actually did, and more rhetorically effective than what they actually did. They had all that been the case, they still would have been on a really, really weak footing, because it was screechingly obvious that that's not how they dealt with any of these matters when the victims were not Jews, and they were any other protected group. As it were, or as it ended up, they actually didn't give a very effective explanation for their case, which made the hypocrisy of it that much worse. Nothing about that surprised me in the slightest. I think a lot of the shock that some people on the left had by the enthusiasm for parts of the academic left for Hamas and for the October 7th attacks was that in their minds there was this very clear, bright line around the issue of violence. And so when they saw that people were supporting what was a horrific, violent attack, they were genuinely taken aback. They didn't expect this. And I wrote the week that it happened that I actually wasn't surprised in the slightest. I don't think that the issue of violence was ever the bright line that people thought it was. Firstly, because there has always been this violence. But secondly, because the imagined ideological commitment that we think people had, right, which is, again, as we said, that Israel is uniquely evil, not just as a state and a government, but that its people are evil, its existence is a crime, its language is an assault, as a recent article in the Boston Review of Books informed us. Its food is tainted. Everything, and if it ever does something that appears to be good, it's actually even worse because they're just washing. It seems weird to believe all that, to imagine that somebody believes all that and then opposes violence against Israelis. That to me makes no sense, actually. So that that enthusiasm there that some liberals were shocked at by kind of the radical left on college campuses, I wasn't shocked at. I actually completely expected it. I expected it also because I'm old enough to remember, what things looked like in 2002 during the peak of the suicide bombing campaign, when the exact same thing happened.
So, of course, like Shany, I was not surprised. In truth, I also, in the beginning, I didn't even pay much attention because I just thought it was ridiculous theater all around. And like Shany, it wasn't a serious discussion of what was going on. So in that sense, I think it was ridiculous theater. And if I go to your previous question of are we talking about it too little or too much, that specific discussion, we're talking about way too much. That in itself is ridiculous theater. It is perhaps valuable only insofar that people are beginning to look at what the narrative weavers are actually weaving. What is the story that is being created and recreated that makes sense of the world for the new generation? And what role Israel has, indeed, as this unique evil entity in this newly created worldview. I want to add something here, which, at least for me, has been very valuable. I always highlight the work of Isabella Tabarovsky, who helped me more than anyone to realize that all the language that we use now to create this theology of Israel is uniquely evil was created by the country that really has contributed more than anyone and really has not received sufficient credit for that, to create the worldview of scapegoating of Jews. And that's, of course, the Soviet Union and Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia contributed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which today we don't realize it, but 120 years ago, publishing a book was a big deal. Today, anyone can do it. But giving the respectability of a published hardcover book to free-floating conspiracy theories was a critical transition from the authority of the church to the authority of printed material. And the authority of the printed material in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was crucial to the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe. I mean, the Nazis really, in terms of ideas, they did not introduce anything new. And the Soviet Union, which supposedly was against anti-Semitism because that belonged to the hated Tsar or to the defeated Nazis, created anti-Zionism, but with the same mechanism of respectability, of academic conferences and papers and cross-references. And there's so many cross-references that at one point you just can't undo the whole mechanism because it seems like a real serious academic paper with numerous footnotes, and people got PhDs in anti-Zionism. Leaders of Palestinians, including Mahmoud Abbas, they got PhDs in that. So it's not a coincidence that Jews from Soviet background were the first to recognize the rise of that particular strain in America, because they fled precisely from that scapegoating mechanism of the failed Soviet Union that basically said, we have nothing against Jews. It's not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is actually what we defeated when we defeated Nazi Germany or when we defeated the Tsar. It's only about Zionists, but they knew how the mechanism worked, how the Hebrew language was criminalized, how Jews were basically singled out as having Zionist sympathies and then persecuted. Even the mechanism of creating the good Jews, of platforming Jews who are willing to persecute other Jews in the name of anti-Zionism, all of that exists in full-fledged form in the Soviet Union and gets actively, not passively, gets actively exported to left-wing circles beginning in the 60s and 70s in Europe, and ultimately from the kind of admiration of Anglo academia to French and German left-wing intellectuals makes it to the Anglo academia where it flourishes. So Jews from the background of the Soviet Union in America were able to listen to that tone very quickly and to realize where it's heading, when other regular American Jews kept on saying, no, no, it's about Israel, or, you know, it's because of Netanyahu or because this government. They already knew how this plays out, and that's why they were some of the earliest people to speak out against it. And by now, as a result, I don't call it anymore woke or progressive. I just call it American communism or Western communism, because this is what it is. And it is the greatest legacy of the Soviet Union in the West.
Thank you, Einat. I do want to open it up for questions from you. I know there are a couple of people who use the chat. I do want to go first to our President and CEO of the JCC Association of North America, Doron Krakov, for a first question. Doron, bevakasha.
Uriah, great to see you. Thank you, Einat. Wonderful to be together. Shany, it's a great pleasure to hear from you as well. So on behalf of all of my colleagues, thank you. It strikes me that the presence of anti-Semitism is probably a constant at some level below the surface, but it requires a preponderance of circumstances to allow it to be released, certainly to the degree that it has here. Our initial inclination will be to confront it as a Jewish community, but in point of fact, while I believe we can strengthen our ability to contend with it, the Jewish community doesn't have the wherewithal to overcome it or to remove it as a prominent feature of society. We're going to have to contend with it through the broader mechanisms of American or Western society. I would be grateful if you would comment on what are the prospects of being able to access those pathways in broader society to tackle the environment in which anti-Semitism seems to be thriving, as opposed to falling back on the reflexive impulse to simply take on anti-Semitism directly. And again, if we had figured out a way to take it on directly, we would have resolved it centuries ago.
Should I answer?
Oh.
Sure. I'll start with answering your question with a continuation of what Einat was saying about the Soviet practice. They called it Zionology, by the way. and how it begins in the academic system, not coincidentally, it was you can be cynical about it too, but in the Soviet system, the rise of Zionology was a crucial aspect in competing for difficult to get academic jobs. Shutting out Jews who were, only about at their peak 3% of the Soviet population, but hugely overrepresented in academic life, was very important. And obviously, you didn't want to shut out Jews as Jews, although that happened too in the Soviet Union. But the first thing you did was shut out the Jews who were Zionists, promote the tiny Jewish minority of anti-Zionists, the crowd that I call the proud to be ashamed, and the ones who actually furthered the goals of Zionology. And so that is a big part, and it's not coincidentally something that happens in the American Academy, particularly where the job crisis is acute in the humanities and then spreading out from there. It's been in fields that have nothing to do with Jews. The anti-Zionist hysteria has been a great way of weeding out lots of resumes. Anybody who did a year abroad at Ben-Gurion University or whose experience involves volunteering at something like that instantly has something to answer for and is back-footed in any competition here. The incentives, of course, are to then be one of the baptized Jews who tells everyone the truth about the rest of the community. The question you asked about the U.S. and lacking the wherewithal. There's a good country to look at here, and it's not the Soviet Union, it's the UK. The UK was in many ways about 10 years ahead of Israel on all these issues. It came to the fore after 2015 with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, but the problem that had been there, the kind of what we would later think of as Corbynism or Corbynite anti-Semitism, had been working its way through the establishment at that point for about 20 years. In fact, in many ways, really since the 1980s. I won't go into too much detail about British history. Actually, the key period in Britain was the 5 years between 1982 and 1987. I can go into more detail for anybody who's really curious, but I will skip that. In the Corbyn years, there were two groups of people who were actually key to the entire battle on this. And they were small. One was the people I call the proud to be ashamed. The same, the same 10, 20 losers who sign every letter to the editor in The Guardian about I'm Jewish, but I was lied to at summer camp, and I went to Israel and I discovered how racist it is, and please stop conflating anti-Semitism with whatever. It's a very, very small number of people. You can make an entire career out of it. Many of them, by the way, end up getting kind of chewed up and spit out of the system. A whole bunch of them who became little minor celebrities in intellectual circles by speaking out against the Jewish community eventually reached a limit, reached a level of ambient anti-Semitism around them that they couldn't tolerate, said something, and were immediately excommunicated from the community, only to be replaced by the next one. This happened. I mean, I watched this happen, particularly in the opinion pages of The Guardian over the last 25 years or so. The influence of this small group was huge, and the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, did not know how to stand up to them and did not think that it was right to stand up to them until very, very, very late in the game. The second group of people that's extremely, extremely key to keep an eye on were I call them the liberal anti-Semites. These were people who were from the left, not Jewish, not married to a Jew, not having volunteered on a kibbutz, really just people who looked at left-wing anti-Semitism and thought it was ridiculous, did the most effective thing in British politics you can do when you want to defeat somebody, which is mock them. And they were almost non-existent until about 2017. For most of the 2000s, and really already for the rise of Corbyn, and then after he was already the leader of the opposition in 2015, for at least the first 2 years, the only people in British political and cultural life who were speaking out about left-wing anti-Semitism or about anti-racist anti-Semitism or anti-Zionist anti-Semitism were first and foremost Jews, which is important, but not enough. And whenever it was somebody who wasn't Jewish, you always found out they had a Jewish wife or some connection to Israel or something. Or they were people from the right wing of politics who had every reason, who had a million other reasons to be wanting to say these things, which doesn't make their critiques wrong. It just meant that it was less likely to have the effect that it needed on the places where it was. The important person, by the way, who was a huge turning point in this, people forget it, was J.K. Rowling. She was one of the first people who came from sort of within the liberal camp, who had no connection to Jewish life, no special connection to Israel. By the way, what does she think about Israel and our conflict? I have no idea. She's never expressed anything about it. And who suddenly started talking about the left-wing anti-Semites and did, like I said, laughed at them. And then a few others did. And suddenly, as soon as people started seeing other people doing it, it became possible. And by 2018, this was a sort of standard line to take. Left-wing anti-Semites were routinely being mocked as cranks, conspiracy theorists, and everything else. That was a massive turning point in the whole discussion. The US is not only 10 years behind, in a certain sense, it's even 20 or 30 years behind, because there are still liberal anti-Semites in the establishment. They just don't realize that they're losing, or some of them do. I mean, I remember when there was the whole Ilhan Omar business with the Benjamins and whatever, you had somebody like Nancy Pelosi instinctively wanting to do a censure resolution and thinking it would be trivially easy to do, and then discovering it wasn't. I mean, her party had changed. And in fact, when you look around the Democratic Party and you see the people who are real committed liberal anti-Semites, almost all of them are like 80 years old, you know? They're really not where so the US is not just one phase behind Britain, it's in many ways two phases behind Britain. It's at that place where the only people willing to take a stand either have an obvious personal stake or come from the opposing political camp. Also, in US politics, just laughing at people doesn't work in quite the same way as it does in British politics. You have to do other things in the US too in order to win an argument. That's a separate topic. But if you as a community are looking at these things and trying to figure out how to come up with a strategy, and you're right in your question, it's not something you can just win decisively. Those are the two groups you want to keep a real eye on the whole time. Understand the proud to be ashamed Jews, and in the US today, they're a very small number with a huge outsize footprint. There was a period when Andy Rosenthal was editing the New York Times op-ed page from about 2005, 2015. There was almost every single week an op-ed of "I'm a Jew, and here's why I discovered Israel's racist." That ended in about 2015, or slowed down a lot after 2015 when there was a changing of the guard there, but never really disappeared. It's an obsession. Some of them are very brilliant. Occasionally there's people where it's at such a low intellectual level, you know that this would never make it into such an important paper if it weren't doing that. They have an entire magazine now, God knows who funds it, with the most absurd things that are always an expression of American anxieties. Just to give you two prominent examples, or three prominent examples, right? When questions of racist police violence came up in the US after Ferguson, you had a torrent of articles about how the American police are supposedly learning their racism and violence in Israel, that then become quoted from each other. So that, later I challenged an editor at the New York Review. He printed something like that, and I said, this is based on nothing. And he cited all these other things, and I said, follow the links. Because when you click on each one of the links that he put there, they all either cited somebody else or cited something that had nothing to do with the case that was being made. There was a program of the NYPD in Israel, but when you followed the link, you discovered it was for investigating financial crimes. There was a program of the DC police in Israel had everything to do with airport security. Silly things like that. The next one was the COVID vaccines. It's hard for us to remember, but there was a real anxiety about COVID and then vaccines and coming back out and whether you could go out again. And there was an obsession in those early weeks of January 2021 when the vaccines were first enrolling with how Israel was supposedly distributing the vaccine in a racist way, something that was completely false. And then later, during the whole George Floyd thing, you had one of your leading American Jewish intellectuals, as everyone was re-examining issues of race, saying that the pro-Israel lobby was the reason why Black people were not advancing in the US diplomatic corps. And in a sense, every time you have a kind of big social anxiety now, you immediately use the word Israel, but when you say that, nobody actually thinks, when you make a claim like that Israel is blocking Black people from advancing in the diplomatic corps. Everybody gets the message. The message isn't about Israel, it's about American Jews.
Shany?
Yeah.
We just have a few more questions in the chat.
Sorry.
Thank you, Dawn, and I want Einat to give her, maybe she will answer the next one. There's Ruth who raised her hand, but before that, I know Hila asked a couple of questions. One of them is huge. What is the reason for anti-Semitism? I think it's a different. I mean, we should answer that, but it's a full session about that. But she was also asking about, not sure I understand how anti-Semitism directed against Jews is not because we are Jews. So if you want to relate to that, there was also a kind of question is that just a small one. Can we get the name of the scholar you were talking about who helped to frame the theory that scapegoating Jews were reinforced by the Soviet Union? So if you can take all three into like one answer, that would be great. Thank you. And thank you, Dawn.
Sure, I'll do my best and you'll remind me if I forgot anything. Her name is Isabella Tabarovsky. Follow her writings on Twitter. She really has made a seminal contribution in understanding the roots of what we call today left-wing or progressive anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union. It's one of those things that once you see them, you can't unsee them. It's pretty much definitive. So that's Isabella. I should have been precise. When I said anti-Semitism is never because of the Jews, the full phrase, it's never because what the Jews have done. So anti-Semitism always claims that it is merely the rational response to Jewish action, to Jews being too rich or too poor, or stealing our land or taking our money, or so there's always an explanation that puts the reasoning for the persecution of Jews on Jewish action, but it is always an excuse. So that's what I want to say. I want to say that the rise of anti-Semitism is a scapegoating mechanism that is directed at Jews and provides numerous excuses as to why what the Jews have done right now is the reason, but those are always excuses. They're masks, they're covers, they're not the actual reasons. And the way you expose it is typically, I mean, it was mentioned here again and again, by hypocrisy, by basically you look at whether those standards are employed when it's not Jews, and then you realize it's not. And then you realize that, again, the problem is not what the Jews have done. It's not this Israeli government, this Israeli policy, that Jewish financier. It's what is happening in the society that is persecuting the Jews that led it to grab to that very reliable scapegoat. And I emphasize that because it ultimately is about free riding on cultural capital, it really only is ever fully effective in the Muslim and in the Christian world, whether it's the Soviet Union or Europe or the United States, but any country that is based on the substrate of Christianity. So, and by the way, in parentheses, we are now witnessing a massive Chinese effort to create cultural capital around that. And once that becomes I think that will be also deeply disconcerting. But historically, India, China, because they have no specific relationship in their theological systems, in their cultural systems for Jews, when they experience crises, and they have plenty, they don't turn to Jews as scapegoats. They have their own, because there's no cultural capital there to draw on. It's not a readily available, understood dog whistle or scapegoat. So that's what I meant by that it's not about the Jews. I meant that it's not about what the Jews are doing. And maybe then I can briefly address Doron's question. We have internalized the idea that, but it still is about what Jews are doing. It must be, because it's really difficult for us to come to terms with the fact that it's on them, not on us. So we internalize the thing of like, what have we done? If only we had a different Israeli government, if only Netanyahu behaved differently, if only Jews didn't do this, if only we didn't do that. There's always that thinking, even among the most knowledgeable people who understand anti-Semitism. It's very hard to survive an incessant decades and centuries and millennia-long onslaught without internalizing some of it. So first, I want to help you not internalize it. It's not about us. And why is it important not to internalize it? Because it often serves as the thing that prevents us from taking action. Because if we think that the problem is us, then we are going to spend too much time and too much effort on solving issues about us that are not the problem. And by the time we understand that it's not us, it's sometimes too late. So I want as early as possible to throw away the notion that it's about us. We can debate whatever we want and we can argue on whatever we want, but we need to coordinate off with the understanding that that is not the cause. That is not the reason. The root cause is in the crisis of the society. That is, by the way, in parentheses, the answer, I'm sure you've heard of the Jewish paradox in America, of why American Jews make money like, I think it's Episcopalians, but vote like Puerto Ricans. And the answer is simple, an insurance policy. Jews know that when societies are in crisis, they are the first line of scapegoating. So even when Jews are successful and they have wealth, they have an interest in higher taxes in a more progressive and liberal society because they assume that those are generally societies that are less prone to crisis. Societies with high inequalities are more prone to crisis. And again, Jews are at the front line of that. So that's the explanation for that paradox. And that is for me to say that, Doron, I think the Jews have not even begun to scratch the surface of what they can do as Jews. Long before we seek allies or the liberal anti-Semites, long before we seek them, and that's important, we have not even begun to do as a people what is needed to do. We are still too much internally focused on what we are not doing right. And I think as soon as we can be outer directed, as soon as we can be more forceful, I supported very early on the change, for example, in AIPAC strategy to ensure that anti-Zionist members of Congress do not even make it to the primaries. And I know a lot of people were queasy about that because that was too forceful, that was too open. But there's actually no other way. I'll use the Arendt quote: if you're attacked as a Jew, defend yourself as a Jew. I think the Jewish community is not even close to mobilizing all its resources and standing in order to make it clear that no passerà, that this shall not pass in America.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and I know Ruth, are you still here? Ruth Fletcher,
Thank you.
if you can unmute. Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Right. I appreciate that. And in fact, I'm smiling because my question was based on local government, and I like what you just said quite a bit. I think that across the country, what we're seeing, or at least I know where I live in Silicon Valley, and I know that in the Bay Area, we have had some struggles with local government, local school districts, where they're trying to pass various resolutions. And it's been really tough. So we have our local Jewish communities coming out and showing support and trying to engage to create an environment where the Jewish community is heard a little bit differently. And I just wanted to say that I think that what we, the American Jewish community, is looking for is, again, ways to be action oriented in the face of anti-Semitism. And I appreciate the thoughts today. I know that we're running out of time, but if you had a couple of words for us in the vein that you were just speaking about we're just beginning to find ways to, we're just getting started rather on the action. I'm really curious as to know where you think we can go.
So I'll say something that might be a bit harsh, but I would say that all the assimilation money should go to fighting money. What is the assimilation money? All the money that has gone to fund university buildings, hospitals, museums, social justice causes that are not our own. Not the time right now. I think it has reached its peak, and all that investment is guaranteed to go to waste if Jews are not going to redirect all the resources to fighting for themselves and be unapologetic about fighting for themselves. And we're still not there, but that is basically where I would say to be much more vocal about speaking out. We're still seeing people, especially people who feel that they have attained the heights of American society, who are fearing to speak for fear of losing something. And the thing is that it's exactly the opposite. If they do not speak up, they are guaranteed to lose something. So I think a lot of it is about internally recognizing that all the resources that were spent into being accepted now need to be turned into fighting. And to the extent that any Jews have any kind of lingering unease with that, I will emphasize in doing so, you are fighting not just for Jewish life in America, you are fighting for America, because no society has ever come out better when the arc of anti-Zionism is complete. And in terms of the argument, this is by far the most effective argument. When I speak to students, they tell me that this has been the most effective argument that they've made. It's not about Jewish suffering. It's not about anything of the sort. They simply say quite clearly, any society that has seen the rise of anti-Zionism and it went unopposed and unarrested saw no Jews left. And the society collapsed onto itself. And then ask your local government, your schools, your universities, is that the future you want? Do you want, and basically make the case to them that it's unquestionable. When anti-Zionism rises and it is unopposed, no Jews are left, and the society experiencing the rise of anti-Zionism collapses. That's the arc. Do they want that arc? That's it. Don't make it about sympathy for Jewish suffering or Holocaust education or anything of the sort. Just make it about standing your ground for your right as a people to thrive and live in the United States, and for America not going the way of the Soviet Union or Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party or the failed areas of the Arab world. That's my.
Thank you. And I would just add one other thing. I mean, I have this sticky note on my desk, that I've had for a couple of years, but anti-Semitism galvanizes all sorts of things. So it's not only about the Jews. So, I mean, it galvanizes white nationalism, galvanizes all sorts of hateful things. So I think that people really miss that mark. And that's what I like to share with others.
Yeah. Professor Ruth Weiss defines it as the political organization against the Jews. I use a similar one of the scapegoating mechanism, but ultimately it's a political tool that allows failed ideologies, failed societies that would never be able to mobilize support and allies to create political alliances that would otherwise be unimaginable.
Shany, I mean, if you have, we have 1 more minute, if you want to add something to that question, and then we have to close up.
Add to the list of states that took on anti-Zionism as a central organizing bit of politics. Modern states, I would put Poland and Venezuela. Poland in the 1960s and Venezuela in the 2000s, and in both cases there was no Jewish communities left at the end. And in terms of what can be done, the one emphasis that I would make is don't look only at downstream effects. I think fighting the battle on campus activism or social media or whatever is fighting it way too late. The mobilization of the ideological mobilization of so much of American intellectual life behind the idea of Israel as unique evil and Israel's supporters in America as being complicit in a unique evil is not something that started with that surface level. It was a decades-long campaign. It expressed itself in academic life, in scholarship, in the activities of NGOs, in education, in all these places. Getting Jews, and especially Jews who are raising money for the cause of anti-Semitism, to care about those things, I think is traditionally hard. They want to do, slick social media campaigns and 10 points about why this is that, and whatever. But the effort needs to be really deep inside. Don't get these the anti-Semitism that almost slipped through in California in the ethnic studies curriculum is something that has to be fought. What's going on at the university, not just in the student activists, in the way that scholarship is conducted there, in the way that Jews and people who are not committed anti-Zionists are shut out of entire departments, in the endless research budgets for new projects exposing this inherent Israeli evil or not. That's where you need to fight, and this is a generational project. It's not going to be solved overnight.
Thank you, Ruth. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Einat Wilf and Dr. Shany Moore. I mean, we can talk about it for hours now, but this is just a little bit of where we are right now. I mean, we started it in years ago, but in the last 2.5 months, this is where our minds go to. I want to thank you so much. It was fascinating. It was important to listen to you. It is 2:03 in New York. It's 9:03 p.m. here in Jerusalem. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the JCC Association of North America and the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs for your support. Toda rabba and Laila Tov. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.